as we lived at home on the farm, and take you to school, district school, which was about a half mile from our place. And there was nothing unusual about that, excepting it was a large school, and we had to have a very strong disciplinarian for a teacher, and at times my father was a trustee of the whole Unity Township, not of that one school as we had here in New York State. And so most of our teachers turned out to be men, and to show you how short the span of life is, one of our teachers was J.H. Kelly, and my father was on the school board, and it was sort of natural to make the appointment for your own school. And we kids used to, when Kelly wasn't around, we used to sing J.H. Kelly with the buckskin belly. And then he left, of course, and we lost track of him until your father went to Ambridge. And when he went to Ambridge, he went there largely through the influence of J.H. Kelly, who was then a businessman, and I think he was an insurance man, but I know he was a Rotarian, because one time when I visited up there, your father made it a point to me to meet J.H. Kelly, but he warned me not to say anything about J.H. Kelly's influence in getting him to come to Ambridge. So I met J.H. Kelly, and of course he didn't remember me. In fact, he didn't remember your father very well either, but he remembered our father, remembered him very well, and had great respect for him, and through that influence he went there. Well, now to go back to the Oak Hill District School, which was a large school and out in the country, and probably pretty poor schooling as we knew it, excepting that we were taught the 3 R's, and we were given quite a good basic foundation in reading, writing, and arithmetic. And to give you one of the things that I remember, the roads in those days, of course, in the winter and spring when they weren't frozen, you could sink into the mud way up over your shoe tops. And in the winter, at times, we had a lot of snow and a lot of cold, hard weather. And we had a little mare we called Topsy. And more than once I can remember, when we were quite small, but going to school, of my father going out and getting Topsy and bringing her in, putting all 3 of us boys on her. John was the oldest, and so he was sat in front, and your father next, and I next. But he was very careful not to feed her. And we rode up to school, tied up the reins under the throat latch, and turned Topsy loose, and she hightailed it for home in a hurry because she knew when she got home she'd get her ropes.
Well, you mean you did this every day?
No, just in severe weather.
I see.
When it was too severe to walk or too muddy to walk, or any time that the weather was real bad. And that way we got to school. Then, now where do you want me to go from there? That was our schooling, our grade schooling, and we've only, your father went through the 8 grades. But before we got there, of course, we went to Latrobe to finish up our grade school. Your father entered there, I think, in the 7th grade, and I think I entered in the 6th because my sister Ada was teaching there then. And we were traveling back and forth more or less anyhow with a horse and buggy. And then your father got through grade school and entered high school. And he was always 2 years ahead of me because he's 2 years older. And
well, before we get into high school, Uncle Charles, can I ask you about Father as a boy? What kind of interests did he have, or hobbies, or habits, or can you tell us?
I can't say that we had many hobbies, Martin. When we got home from school, we had to help with the chores. We had a small dairy, and all was chores to do. Several horses to take care of, the milking to do, and fuel to get in for overnight, although later years we had a furnace and then it wasn't so hard. Our hobbies were mostly with the horses. It was our delight to get a colt that never had been ridden before and see who could ride her and stay on.
Oh, is that right?
And things of that kind, and that always happened when my father was away. And then oftentimes, many times, we would take 2 horses, even maybe the work horses, and start down the road. There was no traffic, of course, and go lickety-larp or go over and get the cows and see who could more quickly take off the bridle while we were going on a gallop. Take off the bridle, show it, hang it in the air, and then put it back on. Mind you, this was regular circus work while we were riding the gallop. And the neighbors used to tell my father every once in a while, those boys will kill themselves riding those horses.
Well, I never heard that.
Yeah.
And bareback, was this?
Oh, yes, bareback. The only saddle we ever had was for driving a 4-horse team. Put a saddle on the saddle mare, on the one next to on the tongue.
Oh, I see.
And then drive with a single line, remember? Of course, that's what my brother John, your Uncle John, that was his delight all his life, to drive a 4 or a 6-horse team with a single line and by word of mouth. And that's what he did with mules for years in hauling lumber out to the St. John's, was it? No. Out to the Catholic institution there outside.
St. Vincent's?
Yes, St. Vincent's. And my father always had a close relationship with them, and we always raised a couple colts, and when they were broken, he'd sell them to them. There was never an equivalent. If he said he wanted $300 for the pair or $200, thank you, bring them out. And they had the cash ready. He had a wonderful relationship, and then that paid off to him when he was later in life, ran for justice of peace, and he had to be elected by the whole town. And he was a Democrat, and they were all Democrats, and he'd carry it like a breeze. But they always supported him, which was a little unusual because even if a Catholic ran, didn't make any difference. They supported Luther Fausold.
I see.
Squire Fausold, as he was known later. Well, to go back, the only thing we ever did, had time to, in the summer, we worked long hours, all of us. And so we didn't have time for hobbies. The only hobby I can remember that we had particularly was with a sled in the wintertime. Sled riding, we called it. And we had to make our own sled. It would be homemade. We had very little money. My father got through with very little cash. Later years we talked about it, and we thought probably he never had more than $1,000 cash in a year. But he did a lot of bartering. And we ran our own farm and the Anderson farm, which is 2 miles away, and we made an awful lot of hay and some grain, and that was our early life. And we started in early, too. We started in to milk cows when we were hardly big enough to sit up to them.
What, 5, 6 years? Now, how old were you?
Well, we would probably be not over 8 when we started. And so we always had cows to milk in the morning, cows to milk in the evening, although my father always liked to milk, and he always did his share and more, too. But outside of a few homemade things like that in coasting, we never had any hobbies. Now, in the evenings, especially winter evenings, we would gather around the stove, and my mother would be knitting. She was always busy knitting or doing something. My father would be reading, and we'd play games like dominoes and checkers and simple little games like that. We didn't even have Monopoly in those days. And then we'd go to bed early. And many times, in the wintertime, of course, we undressed out by the kitchen stove where it was good and warm, and then hightailed it upstairs where there was no heat at all and went to bed.
Well, what time?
Well,
8 o'clock?
This would be not later not later than 9, as the rule would be any time from 8 to half past.
And of course, you got up at 6 o'clock.
Oh, then we got up early. My father would get up first, and from the time he left his bedroom and all the way down the stairs and into the kitchen, he'd keep yelling, "Come on, boys, now get up. Come on, get up." And in the summertime, he'd see to it that we got up real early because we had to have our chores done by the time the dew was off, so we'd go to farming. And I'll tell you one instance. When we were kids, you may have heard this, Sam and I, your father and I, were out what we called the coal house, and we were splitting some wood for kindling wood. And he was in the coal house, and so was I, and something happened, and I turned around and called my mother. I was going to tell Mother what he was doing. I don't know what he was doing. Anyhow, he had an axe in his hand, splitting kindling, and so to scare me, I stood in the doorway with my back to him. He whirled his axe up over his head to hit the top of the door. And he missed the top of the door and came down and hit me flat on the head. Now that would have, without question, have split my head open and killed me if it hadn't been that I had one of these wool caps that we all wore then over our heads, and it was 4-ply.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you put it up, and it was really heavy, 4-ply. But I carried that scar for a long time. It was deep enough so I could lay my finger in it.
Yeah.
And I still have it, but it's almost filled in now, as you can see. But I remember that, and I remember one time we had an argument, all 3 boys of us, as to whether or not if you touched this crowbar, which was standing up against the coal house, with your tongue, whether you could do that, and whether it would stick.
Whether what would stick?
Your tongue. This was in the wintertime when it was real cold, and that thing had been standing out there and it was frozen through.
Yeah.
And my father heard us talking about that, and he forbid us to try such a thing. Well, of course, we went right out and tried it after breakfast. Your father tried it first, and he yanked back and pulled the skin all off the top of his tongue.
Yeah.
And that was one of the few times in my life that I saw my father really disturbed and upset, and he caught your father and gave him a good thrashing.
Yeah.
And, of course, when we saw what happened to Sam, we didn't try. We knew enough not to try it.
Well, he gave him a thrashing with what? With his hand or a stick?
No, he would pick up a broomstick or anything he could find.
Well.
When he went into one of those tempers, he really thrashed you. And so your father not only had the skin off the top of his tongue, which was very, very painful and sore for several days, but he also had the thrashing in addition.
Yeah.
Well, then, of course, our experiences in going to grade school in Latrobe were something. We would drive whatever horse was available. Sometimes it would be a great big heavy work horse. Sometimes it would be our driving horse, Topsy. And in the wintertime, in real cold weather, and as I think back over it, I'm surprised that the weather was so cold, but it was. And, of course, we all wore long johns and all that, and covered up all we could, but still you were in an open buggy, and it was 6 miles. And the roads were bad in the winter and spring, and it would take you a good hour to drive that 6 miles, and after we got there, we had to take the harness off the horse, put her in, give her hay, and then go over to school about 2 blocks. And many times when we got over there, by the time we got there, our hands were just about frozen, and we'd get down in the furnace room, and the janitor would let us use cold water to thaw them out before we could go up to class.
Mm-hmm.
It was really rough, and we would have to do our chores first and then have to leave home at least by 8 o'clock or a little before in order to, school started at 9, in order to get there. And then as soon as we got home in the evening, we'd have to put on our old clothes fast and help to do the chores.
Well, by chores, you mean milking?
Milking and feeding the horses
all
and
that.
the hogs, and getting the grain down from the mows upstairs, and of course, we had a regular routine in the wintertime, do that. But first thing when we got home, we had to take care of our horse, whichever one we was driving, and the roads were made of coal ashes. And when they were soft, the horse would sink down in, above her pasture joint.
Yeah.
And if you didn't take care of that, wash it, they would get painful sores, so much so that they'd even limp. So when the roads were wet and the horse was sinking down into those coal ashes, first thing when we got home, we had to take her down to the water trough, the overflow of the water trough, and scrub her all 4 feet. And my father was very particular about that, and we got through it pretty well. But if we didn't do that, well, that all took time, you know. And then, of course, the further we went in school, the more we thought we had to study.
Well, yes, I was going to ask you about that.
And we'd get in the wintertime especially, between next to a hot stove. We sat around the dining room table to do our homework. And the first thing we want to do is go to sleep.
Sure.
And but we got through it somehow, and neither one of us ever made any outstanding records scholastically. We had lots of good times at the rural school, in the old time spelling bees and entertainments, things of that kind. I was telling Elner just not long ago about the time we had a party up at school, some kind of a party, I don't know what it was, but just the neighbors all gathered together for social evening. And among other things, I sang a song that I hadn't heard from that day till this until long about Christmas time this winter. I heard it on TV.
Mm-hmm.
And I sang it, solo.
Yeah.
Of course, your father always kidded me about singing solo. I had a little more music in me than he had. He had very little music in him. And I sang this song, which went up on the housetop, click, 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 down through the chimney with good Saint Nick. There was a whole 2 or 3 verses to it, you know. And then by the time I finished, they did in those days just what they do now. The whole audience joined in on the chorus the last time through. And things like that, we had a lot of social life that way. And then Sunday morning, nobody ever asked whether we were going to church. We went to church. And it was about 3.5 to 4 miles out to the hill churches. And my father would hitch up 2 horses in a carriage. And when it was time to go, why, we were all supposed to be ready and go, and we did. Never got even question.
Everybody went in the family?
Yes, sir. Everybody went. And
well, no, when you were a baby in diapers, you didn't go to church or Sunday school. Your mother did not go to church when you were babies.
I don't remember myself about it, but I remember that it wasn't long until she put us on her lap and took us. The church, I never knew anybody that the church, without being particularly religious about it, I never knew anybody that the church meant more to than to my mother.
Mm-hmm.
And later in life, and your father and I talked about this one time, if there was any time that we were inclined to, well, the heck with it, or we don't know whether it amounts to anything, all we need to do is remember what it meant to our parents, and that brought us back pretty fast.
And it meant the same, it meant a lot to your father, too.
Oh, yeah. He of course, was a clerk of the session, so-called, and for years. And we naturally picked up, even as very small kids and very young kids, the fact that my father was somebody in the church, because at meetings, annual meetings especially, or quarterly meetings, he was sat right down front next to the minister and read the minutes and made comments and what have you. And he always saw to it, no matter how busy we were, that we got to Friday evening, all of us, the whole family, for preparation for communion. We had preparation on Friday night.
Oh, what was this?
Well, they had a religious service, and the pastor went over with us what communion meant, just as they do nowadays, only nowadays they do it just before the service. And then, in connection with that, we had to, before we joined the church, study the catechism and learn it verbatim, which include the Ten Commandments and all the rest of the things that go with it, and what the church laws were and all that stuff. And then the pastor taught those lessons, and after having taken those for maybe 6 months, as soon as you could pass the examination, then you could join the church if the powers that be okayed you. Church was a very strong part of our lives ever since we were little kids. And as I say, we always went, and we all joined, and all buried there.
Did you ever have religious discussions with your father or your mother
No.
on the meaning of religion?
No,
Did
they
you ever question the miracles
no,
in the Bible?
No, we never questioned anything. We just took everything for granted, Martin. Everything for granted, that it must be the right thing because our parents did it. But they never made any, excepting to see to it, my mother saw to it that we read the Bible. And but outside of what we got at catechism, by being made to read the Psalms and things of that kind, we weren't Bible students, and we never questioned the church, never questioned it, because my father and mother never did.
Yeah.
And they never, I think it's so often nowadays, they never said anything degrading about the pastor, no matter whether he was good or bad. He was the pastor, and as long as he was, no remarks about the pastor unless they were complimentary. And the pastor always came to our house several times a year, and he'd stay, for dinner or for supper. And when he did, my father, no matter how busy he was, he'd quit work and entertain the pastor. And it always meant a lot to my mother. She was a good cook and set a nice table. It always meant a lot to her to have the pastor come. Of course, that always meant a chicken dinner.
Yes. How often did he come?
Well, at least, he came,
is that right?
At least 4 times a year, at
right?
least every quarter, and often, some of them, came oftener than others. Of course, they made it a point, I suppose, to keep in close touch with my father, because he was one of the official members of the committee. I've forgotten what to call them now. We call them trustees, as you know, in our Presbyterian church. But
I want to stop. Uncle Charles, let's see, let me test this again here and get it about up to 8. Yeah, I guess that's good. That's maybe I don't even need it quite that high. About like that, I guess. Can you tell me something about what kind of discussions did you have in your house? You say you did not talk about religious things when the family gathered around. What kinds of things did you talk about?
Well, mostly about current, everyday happenings, things that happened to school, and we talked quite a lot about the crops. My father was a very quiet man. He wasn't the kind that talked much, and so for that reason, when he did talk, we paid attention. And but he wasn't what you call a visitor type. But he enjoyed hearing us talk and discuss things, and when it came time, he'd put in his word and either set us straight or do something else. He was very, very much interested in Americanism. Boy, when elections came around, he could hardly wait until the ballots were in to see who was elected president, who was elected governor, all down the line. He was a great American, interested in that way, from the local government to the very top. And in those days, we didn't have telephone. We didn't have, of course, any means of communication excepting with a horse. And I can remember when I was just about old enough and new enough and big enough to, the next morning after election, ride into Latrobe, over to Whitney, where our voting place was, and copy down the people who were elected, and taking it back to my father. I do that even before breakfast, and he could hardly wait till I got back. I don't know why he didn't go himself, but he always sent one of us, horseback. as a result of that, my sister Grace, all her life, went to the same place to vote, and was always the first one there. And she did that so many years that sometimes they even waited for her 15 minutes to give her a chance to get there.
I remember hearing that.
Yes. And she was like my father. She was always strong for politics, very strong. And your father was stronger for politics a good deal than I was. He was more of a historian than I was, interested in history. And so he was more interested in political situations than I was. And as a youngster, in grade school, but particularly in high school, maybe I'm getting ahead now,
That's right.
he liked to make speeches. And in church, as kids, they ask us on Children's Day, you know, to make a little speech and so on. Your father was always good at that because he knew more history than we did. And I remember one time, one of his speeches, he went up there and stood up there and he said, 2,000 years ago, Augustus Caesar was the emperor of Rome. That was his opening sentence. Well, everybody sat up, you know. That's something, nobody knew that out in our congregation, you know. And then he went on from there, and he talked purely historical things that they should have known and didn't. And so he always made a great hit, even as a youngster, you know, because of what he knew about history. And he was just smart enough to capitalize on it, which I never was. Well, then, now where do we go?
Well,
high school?
I was just talking. I was just talking about the conversations that you had with
Oh,
your
yes.
parents.
Well, my mother we always, when we wanted anything or wanted to discuss anything, we always stood a little bit in fear of my father. Great respect for him, but a little bit of fear. And because he was very abrupt with us. He'd say yes or no and meant it, and that's all there was. There's no discussion or argument. But if we wanted particularly to get something, we'd go to my mother and pour our hearts out to her, so to speak. And if she approved of it, and she usually did, we could always wrap her around our finger. She'd go to father, and by hook or crook, she'd get him to agree to let us go to this place or to that place.
She usually did she?
Oh, yes. Yes, she was usually successful in getting to do what she wanted, what we wanted to do as kids. Maybe we wanted to go to a party or something like that required the use of a horse and buggy. Nobody ever took a horse and buggy unless my father knew about it and approved of it to go anywhere.
Let's see, what was I? You haven't mentioned the store, Uncle Charles. Did
Well,
you have a store when you
all
were
right, now.
children?
I spoke to you earlier that we lived through the year on very little cash money. My father did a lot of bartering. For instance, in the fall or early winter, I remember one time he was doing it with horses in a bobsled. He would take a good big load of baled hay to Latrobe to a grocery store run by Mr. Kelsey. He'd take it in there, and Mr. Kelsey would give him credit for it, not money. And then my father would load onto the sled a whole barrel of flour and things like that we'd use every day, like salt and sugar, especially sugar, a whole barrel of sugar. And many times, strange to say, he would bring home along with everything else a barrel of select choice Northern Spy apples or Baldwins. And then he always, of course, we had our own meat, so he didn't need much money. Well then, however, he always had, and we worked out our taxes, you know, with a team of horses on the road. We never paid any taxes in money. At least when we were growing up and through college, your father and I worked on the road in the summertime, work out our taxes, and if they didn't have enough to do that, we'd work a little extra and get a little cash, get paid for it. But My father then, he was justice of the peace, they called him squire, for I think it was 32 years altogether. And he had to be elected every, I think it was 4 years. And anyhow, meantime, he needed a little more cash, and he was getting, although he
Did that pay the justice?
Well, yes, it paid some money, you see. He got some money for it. His fees,
Yeah.
just in fees, no payment otherwise. And, but people in the community respected him, and he was the judge of all the local disputes and everything that came up. And somehow or another, he seemed to get away with it pretty well, because he never, when he had a trial, he never discussed it much. He'd make up his mind pretty soon who was right and who was wrong, and he'd stop it right there, and he'd say, you're guilty, pay so much.